Queen Elizabeth's dark ancestry, the Bloody Tudor Legacy. The air in Westminster Abbey was always heavy with whispers, but on that night it was different. Torches flared against ancient stone as if the flames themselves knew the weight of the secrets lingering in the rafters. Elizabeth Tudor, just a girl then, barely 14, wandered the cloisters while her tutor searched for her in vain. She had grown used to slipping away from prying eyes, for she carried questions no one dared to answer. Her mother's fate was carved into her bones, and every shadow reminded her of Anne Boleyn's fall. A queen crowned, accused, and executed within 3 short years. Elizabeth's lips pressed tight whenever her name was spoken in public, because the courtiers' eyes always lingered on her afterward, as if her mother's alleged sins lived on in her daughter's blood. But there was more, something darker that she sensed but could not yet name. "Your Majesty's daughter should not wander the abbey after dusk," a voice whispered from behind a column. Elizabeth froze. An old nun stepped into the torchlight, her face creased with age, her eyes like dim lanterns in a storm. "I am no Majesty's daughter," Elizabeth replied sharply, though her heart fluttered at the thought. Her father was still alive then, King Henry VIII, bloated with power, ruthless with wives and ministers alike. But he scarcely acknowledged her, favoring instead his sickly son, Edward. The nun inclined her head. "That is what the world believes, but blood remembers, blood curses, and the Tudors, ah, child, they are not as they seem." Elizabeth felt the hairs on her arms rise. "What do you mean?" she demanded. The nun leaned close, breath like old parchment. "Your grandfather, Henry Tudor, he was not meant to be king. His claim was weaker than thread. He seized the throne through bloodshed, through the betrayal of kin, and through secrets buried in the marshes of Bosworth. Do you think such things do not cling to a family's soul? Every crown he won dripped with curses, and every heir of his will pay." Elizabeth's throat went dry. She wanted to ask more, but the nun pressed a brittle hand to her lips. "Ask nothing now. You will learn whether you wish it or not. Your mother's death was only the beginning. The Tudors' hands are never clean, and when your time comes, Elizabeth, you too will stand in the shadow of their sins." The torches hissed as a draft swept through the corridor. When Elizabeth blinked, the nun was gone. For years afterward, she told herself it had been imagination. Yet the warning stayed with her, tightening around her heart as the family saga unfolded. Her father's descent into tyranny, her brother's fragile reign, her sister Mary's rivers of fire and blood. Elizabeth would learn the truth piece by piece, through betrayal, through terror, through whispered revelations in the dark. And she would come to understand that the Tudor legacy was more than a crown. It was a curse. Elizabeth's adulthood was forged in suspicion and survival. The court was a nest of daggers, its marble floors slick with the memory of executions. When Mary Tudor took the throne, declaring herself rightful queen, Elizabeth lived in fear of the Tower, accused of conspiring against her half-sister. She tasted the damp stones of imprisonment, the iron scent of death, and she realized then that the Tudors devoured their own. But in the stillness of her cell, Elizabeth began piecing together the story that had haunted her since girlhood. Hidden manuscripts, whispered confessions from frightened ladies-in-waiting, even strange visions that plagued her dreams, all of them pointed to a truth buried deeper than any grave. The Tudors had not risen by chance. They had bargained for power, and in that bargain the line was cursed. And Elizabeth, the last Tudor, would be forced to bear the weight of it. Elizabeth sat cross-legged in the library of Hatfield, her sharp eyes trailing across a page of Plutarch while the fire hissed in the grate. Outside, the October wind rattled the oaks like bones, but she was absorbed in the words, measuring herself against the fates of queens and empresses of old. Her governess, Cat Ashley, had taught her that books were safer companions than courtiers, and Elizabeth had taken that lesson to heart. Yet even here, among scrolls and Latin phrases, she could not escape the weight of her blood. The portraits in the hall whispered louder than the wind. Her grandfather Henry VIII, with his hawk-like eyes, seemed to look past the gilded frame into her very marrow. He was the one who had torn the crown from Richard III on the fields of Bosworth, his claim as fragile as glass, his victory bought with betrayal and mercenary gold. Elizabeth had heard the whispers that Henry's mother, Margaret Beaufort, had spun webs of prophecy and blood rituals to secure her son's throne, that Richard's corpse had not lain peacefully, but cursed the line that unseated him. Her father, Henry VIII, hung next in the gallery, broad-shouldered, crimson-robed, his gaze defiant, dangerous. Elizabeth had seen him in the flesh, his body swollen with disease, his eyes clouded with rage. To most, he was still a god among men, but she had seen the sores on his legs, the trembling hands, the way he crushed servants with a word. He was the second link in the chain, the monarch who severed England from Rome, who drowned the monasteries in fire and scattered the ashes of faith across the land. All for power, all for legacy. And then there was Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth's mother's portrait was smaller, less grand, her oval face delicate, her dark eyes clever but wary. No crown upon her head, no scepter in her hand, only a faint smile, as though she knew what fate would demand of her. Anne had been accused of witchcraft, of poisoning, of bedding her own brother, though Elizabeth's heart told her none of it was true. Yet in the marrow of her nights she wondered, had her mother drawn on something darker to climb so high so fast? The courtiers had muttered it, the preachers had thundered it. Witch, seductress, cursed. Elizabeth pressed the book shut, the sound cracking through the empty library. What am I to inherit? She whispered aloud. A kingdom or a curse? You will inherit both. She started. The voice was soft, aged, but filled with certainty. Cat Ashley stood in the doorway, her gray veil shifting with the draft. She crossed the room and sat beside Elizabeth, her hand warm on the girl's shoulder. Do not look so frightened, Cat said gently. I have raised you as my own, and I will not lie. You are your father's daughter. You are your mother's child. And through them both, you are heir to a throne that has been won by blood. You cannot change that. Elizabeth clenched her fists in her lap. Then I am doomed. Cat shook her head. No, you are tempered. Steel forged in fire does not break. Remember that, where your father's rage devoured him. Where your mother's ambition destroyed her, you must be wiser. You must carry the weight of their sins and yet make something new. The fire cracked, spitting sparks against the hearthstone. Elizabeth looked into it, as though she might glimpse her future in the flames. Shadows danced across her face, and for an instant, Cat thought she saw a crown hovering above the girl's head, not of gold, but of fire and blood. When Henry VIII finally died and the bells tolled across England, Elizabeth felt both terror and relief. She was 17 then, old enough to understand what came next. Edward, her brother, would rule, frail as glass, and Mary, burning with Catholic zeal, waited for her chance. The Tudor legacy was not unity. It was division. Brother against sister, husband against wife, faith against faith. And in the quiet corners of her heart, Elizabeth wondered if the nuns' warning in Westminster had been true, that the Tudors were not a dynasty, but a curse gnawing its way through every soul it touched. Edward's reign began with trumpets and hollow cheer, though the boy king's cheeks were pale as linen, and his cough rattled like loose coins in a tin. Elizabeth stood at his side during the coronation, her own copper hair gleaming in the torchlight, her eyes keen. She was careful, always careful, never to outshine him. Yet she felt the chill of something unseen, the gnawing presence of their father's shadow stretching long across the abbey floor. Edward was only 9, a child king manipulated by men hungrier than wolves. The protector, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, carried himself as if the crown had been placed on his own head. His reforms swept through the land, tearing at what little was left of the monasteries, choking the poor with fresh taxes, bleeding the kingdom under the guise of godly order. Elizabeth watched it all with silence, storing every lesson in the locked chambers of her mind. Power, she realized, was not inherited. It was taken. But with every council meeting, every sermon in the chapel, the specter of their father lingered. Henry VIII's laws of succession had named Edward first, then Mary, then Elizabeth herself, but the ink was smeared with suspicion. The court had not forgotten Anne Boleyn's fall. Whispers slithered through the corridors. Elizabeth is a bastard, a witch's child, her claim is poison. One winter evening, Elizabeth found herself alone with Edward in his privy chamber. He sat hunched in a great chair, shivering despite the blaze in the hearth. His hands, thin and skeletal, clutched at a prayer book. "Sister," he rasped, looking at her with fever-bright eyes, "you are cleverer than I father said so." Elizabeth stiffened. Praise from Edward was rare, but there was something troubling in his tone. "You are the king," she replied. "Cleverness is nothing beside God's will." Edward coughed, a terrible, racking sound that left blood on his sleeve. He wiped it quickly, embarrassed, and lowered his voice. "If I die, Mary will undo everything. She will bring Rome back. She will burn what father built. But you," he broke off, gasping. Elizabeth's breath caught. The words he had not spoken were louder than those he had. "You must take her place." She wanted to answer, to swear her loyalty, but fear gripped her tongue. To speak of succession while the king still breathed was treason. Treason had killed her mother. Treason had dragged her uncles to the scaffold. She folded her hands in her lap and whispered, "You will not die." But she knew, as he coughed again, that the Tudor curse was tightening. As Edward's health waned, the court grew poisonous. The Seymour brothers fell, Somerset to the Tower, his own kin betraying him for scraps of influence. The Dudleys rose in his place, sharp-eyed John Dudley whispering poison in Edward's ear. It was he who arranged the scheme that would nearly strangle Elizabeth's fate forever. Lady Jane Grey, sweet Jane, Edward's cousin, pious and gentle, a girl who loved her books as Elizabeth did. The Dudleys thrust her onto the throne when Edward's breath finally failed in the summer of 1553. For 9 days, Jane sat crowned, trembling on a seat carved of knives. Elizabeth watched it unfold from the sidelines, her heart torn. Jane was no tyrant, no monster, merely another pawn of the Tudor curse, another soul crushed beneath ambition not her own. When Mary raised her banners in rebellion, Elizabeth felt the ground shift beneath her feet. If Mary won, Elizabeth's life would hang by a thread. If Jane somehow held power, Elizabeth would be next in line to fall, for the Dudleys trusted no one. It was then she understood. The crown was not a prize. It was a trap, baited with glory, snapping shut with blood. When Jane was led to the scaffold in the Tower, Elizabeth closed her eyes and heard the echo of her mother's footsteps on the same stone. And when Mary Tudor rode into London in triumph, the crowds roaring, "God save the Queen," Elizabeth knew the darkest chapter of her family's legacy was about to begin. Mary's reign descended on England like a storm rolling across the fens, slow at first, with distant thunder, then sudden and violent in its fury. At her coronation, the bells rang for hours, and the streets swelled with commoners desperate for bread, for change, for the comfort of a queen who called herself their rightful mother. Elizabeth stood dutifully beside her elder sister, her crimson gown stitched with Tudor roses, her smile cautious. Yet even then, she could feel Mary's eyes on her like a hawk circling its prey. Elizabeth knew what those eyes meant. She had seen them before in her father's face, moments before some poor soul was led away to the block. They were not eyes of love, nor even of sisterhood. They were eyes sharpened by suspicion, by the gnawing fear that Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, the heretic spawn, would take what Mary believed God had finally granted her. The executions began slowly. A few outspoken Protestants burned at Smithfield, their screams mingling with the chants of priests. But soon the pyres multiplied. The stench of charred flesh drifted into the very halls of Westminster, and the people began to whisper of Mary as they once had of her father, cruel, cursed, blood-soaked. She sought to wash England clean with fire, but the more she burned, the blacker her legacy grew. Elizabeth could not move without being shadowed by spies. Her letters were opened, her servants interrogated, her friends dragged to the Tower. At night, she dreamed of her mother's swift fall, of the headsman's blade gleaming in the sun. She had learned young that the Tudors turned on their own, and Mary was no exception. It was Thomas Wyatt's rebellion that nearly ended her. A band of Protestants rose against Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain, fearing England would be swallowed by foreign power. Elizabeth, though innocent, was accused of harboring sympathy for the rebels. Soldiers came at dawn, battering down the gates of her house. She was dragged, trembling, to the Tower of London, the same fortress where her mother had drawn her last breath. The air within those walls was heavy, damp, alive with ghosts. Elizabeth traced the carvings left in the stones by prisoners before her. Names, prayers, curses etched with nails and broken glass. She imagined her mother walking these same steps, breathing this same air. When her jailer slammed the door of her cell, she whispered, "I am Anne Boleyn's daughter. I am Henry's child. If they mean to kill me, let them, but I will not beg." Yet she did pray. Every night she prayed, not only to be spared, but to be made strong enough to bear whatever fate the Tudor curse demanded. Weeks passed. The tower's ravens watched her with black, knowing eyes. Rumors trickled in through guards and servants, executions rising, Mary's council divided, Philip of Spain pressing his claim with icy ambition. Elizabeth's name was tossed like a coin in those chambers, weighed for life or death. One morning, as a pale sun struggled through the mist, she was summoned. Shackled, she was led across the tower yard, her feet dragging on the cold stones. She thought of Anne Boleyn walking here, May 19th, 1536. The date pulsed in her mind like a wound. But instead of the scaffold, Elizabeth was brought before Bishop Stephen Gardiner. He glared at her from beneath his heavy brows, his voice cold as winter. "You are accused of treason, of conspiring with rebels against Her Majesty," he said. "Do you deny it?" Elizabeth met his gaze, forcing steel into her tone. "I deny it, my lord. I have plotted no treason, nor do I seek the crown. I am my sister's loyal subject." Gardiner sneered. "Loyalty is not in the blood of a Boleyn." The words cut, but Elizabeth did not flinch. She remembered Cat Ashley's warning, steel tempered in fire. She was in the fire now, but she would not break. In the end, Mary spared her, not from mercy but from fear. To kill Elizabeth outright would risk rebellion, would make her a Protestant martyr. Instead, Elizabeth was released into house arrest, watched day and night, her every move measured. But in her heart, Elizabeth knew what the ravens already knew. The curse was not finished. And if she lived, the crown of blood would one day be hers.